Welcome to the School of Love, the place where miracles are normal. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the School of Love, the place where we learn practical tools based on scientific research and our own experiences towards improving ourselves, living life to its fullest, and contributing to the best of our abilities to the world around us. I am Dr. Maria Grajdian, and I am a professor of media studies and anthropology at Hiroshima University. In my free time, I am doing my best to guide you in building up a life of fulfillment, joy, and contentment, while applying lessons learned in school to overcome the difficulties, challenges, and insecurities of the real world. In today's video, I talk about the animation movie The Old Man Z, or in Japanese, Rojin Z, directed by Otomo Katsuhiro and released in 1991. 3 years after Akira's brutal dystopy, which marked Japanese animation's breakthrough in the West, Akira's director Otomo Katsuhiro returns with The Old Man Z, or Rojin Z in Japanese, in 1991, an animation movie in which he tackles two of Japan's main problems at the second turn of the millennium, threatening the archipelago both from outside and from inside: the internationally increasing militarization and the uncontrollably aging population. Taking into account three fundamental, partly contradictory, partly overlapping dimensions of aging, festival, apocalypse, and elegia, this video analyzes extensively Otomo Katsuhiro's construction of a dynamic historical universe in Rojin Z, in which aging does not appear as ideologically emotional social recycling of the concerned individuals, but as a future-oriented endeavor to refresh, fulfill, and transcend the human being. And now, first things first, that is, two disclaimers. The first disclaimer serves to strongly emphasize the fact that this YouTube channel, The School of Love, is not part of my educational and research activities at Hiroshima University. It is nonetheless part of my privilege, joy, and sense of duty to propagate and implement knowledge, information, as well as motivation and inspiration outside the limited framework of academic endeavors. Together, we can build up a better tomorrow for as many of us as possible. The second disclaimer relates to the fact that I am a trained musician and musicologist, not a psychologist, therapist, or counselor. The idea I am sharing in my videos reflect my deep-going preoccupation with life, my own life and other people's lives, and express the results of my experiences, research, and for better or for worse, my failures, as well as my recovery from those failures, recovery which is still ongoing. The ideas expressed in the videos on this channel, The School of Love, cannot and may not and must not replace the consultation with specialists in whichever areas of your life you might have questions or you might struggle with. If you are new to the channel, at this moment I would like to please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting. Thank you very, very much. This helps us not only with that mysterious algorithm which seems to dominate the YouTube galaxy, but also with contributing to the expansion of the community of humans doing their best to impact positively the world and those around them by discovering their authentic selves and living life wholeheartedly. Thanks again. It is common knowledge by now that Japanese animation's breakthrough in the West took place after the release of the animation movie Akira in 1988, directed by Otomo Katsuhiro. In Japan, however, Akira was registered as an absolute flop at the box office due to the distortion of the traditional animation framework. Thereafter, during the last 3.5 decades, the animation as ideology and aesthetics became one of the main means for non-Japanese people to perceive and process Japanese contemporary culture, a fact reflected in the establishment of solid internationally networked fan communities who use in quotidian communication Japanese terms borrowed from Japanese animation slang, and to whom such values as honesty, courage, and perseverance are of great importance, precisely due to Japanese animation's influence on their lives and in opposition to the all-encompassing Hollywood trend. Deeply rooted in the Japanese traditional visual and scenic art, Japanese animation emerged from the domestic scroll rolls and color block prints of the Japanese pre-modernity, which were named emakimono and ukiyo-e, and incorporated echoes from the Japanese traditional stage arts as well as from Disney's fantasy and dynamics. As such, Japanese animation continued the aesthetic and ideological Japanese pre-modern visual traditions into the modernity, developing rapidly in the post-war era, so that it soon became related to the political radicalism and countercultural experimentalism of the 1960s, only to find its fullest expression in the flourishing culture industry of the 1970s. Thus, Japanese animation could metamorphose into an alternative stage for new intellectual interests and aesthetic ideological orientations of the Japanese post-war youth, opposed to more conservative outlooks on their own position within the society. Later on, in the 1980s, this revolutionary underground current increasingly mutated into a mainstream movement, registering a noticeable decline during the early 1990s and an unexpectedly explosive revival in the new millennium. Modern high-quality Japanese animation never forfeits its intrinsic connection with its origins, that is, Japanese pre-modern visual and scenic arts, visible in the permanent, sometimes subliminal, sometimes explicit tension between composition and technique, between realism and fantasy, between conformism and revolutionarism, between action and character's design. Individuals striving to overcome their pre-established position within the collectivist system, which transforms such animation works, as to be seen later on, into ambivalent symbols of a new Japan. On the one hand, this new Japan is a dialectic imagined community consisting of selected artifacts imported from the Western material culture and a self-confident nation whose inner strength would proudly decline any appropriation tendencies coming from that very West. On the other hand, this same new Japan is the inheritor and repository of ancient Asian culture histories, actively carrying the responsibility to protect Asia and the Asians from cultural corruption in the globalization age. Thus, though it is regarded as one of the most globalized products of the last decades, Japanese animation is both a culturally oriented yet market-bound product whose relevance rests in its salability, and it appears as an unusually creative and complex phenomenon, reflecting the substantial individual and historical energy, potentials, and contradictions of post-war Japan. In other words, Japanese animation is simultaneously a homogenized, consumer-oriented media driven by prevalent standards and a progressive, significant perpetrator of Japanese culture to the outer world. After Akira's brutal dystopy, the main character, Shima Tetsuo, stays for the disturbed boy in late modernity who cannot regain his identity, be it within an alienating, achievement-oriented system, be it in a liberating outsider position. Akira director Otomo Katsuhiro returned 3 years later with The Old Man Z, or in Japanese, Rojin Z, which was released in 1991, an animation movie in which he tackles two of Japan's main problems at the second turn of the millennium, threatening the archipelago both from outside and from inside: the internationally increasing militarization and the uncontrollably aging population. The plot is quite simple. The trainee nurse, Mitsuhashi Haruko, is informed upon the problem of the population aging, but a practical solution seems to appear as one of her patients, Takazawa Kiyuro, is selected as guinea pig for a government-funded experiment in which he is incorporated into a fully automatic bed. This fully automatic bed is programmed to do everything a patient needs, from bathing the patient up to casual conversation. However, Haruko and her friends feel the urge to save the old patient when it is revealed that the artificial intelligence of the bed is part of a secret military project, and when the bed's AI sets itself free from previous programming in the belief to be the old patient's deceased wife. Obeying the old patient's innermost longings, the bed's AI attempts to reach the great Buddha statue in Kamakura, which had been admired by the freshly united couple during its first dates a long, long while ago. There is a deep-going, heartbreaking contrast between the nostalgic revival of decades-old, partly idealized youth memories, as well as the well-meant enthusiasm of simple people, hospital staff, and aged computer hackers, and the raw, highly developed violence of military forces, which throws a sobering light upon the meaninglessness of technological solutions to the human needs of togetherness. Taking into account three fundamental, partly contradictory, partly overlapping emotional channels in the examination of aging as school endeavor in Rojin Z, which are extensively analyzed later on, this video focuses on Otomo Katsuhiro's construction of a dynamic historical universe in which aging does not appear as ideologically emotional social recycling of the concerned individuals, but as a future-oriented endeavor to refresh, fulfill, and transcend the human self. Contrary to classic live cinema, Japanese animation depends generally on its complex expression channels fusing technology and art, profoundly plunging into the main issues of contemporary life via its rapid variations of the narrative levels, its permanently shifting symbolism, and its focus on characters' development and metamorphosis as basic construction techniques, thus revealing the slithery structure of identity patterns in a world continuously on the run as a symptom and simultaneously as a metaphor for the obsession with radical, spectacular challenges and overwhelming information flows. Within this transformation process from ethics to aesthetics and from message to media, Japanese animation gains a proteic structure to be pinned down in three expression modes: apocalypse, that is the vision of the end of the world; festival, not matsuri, not so fall festival, but carnival in Bakhtinian sense, the pathos of radical change, of death and renewal, as well as elegy, that is pain, loss, absence, as well as nostalgia. Rojin Z incorporates within its expression of aging these three emotional channels. Firstly, apocalypse appears in the character of the weak, dying widower, Takazawa Kiyuro, where aging is the definite, irreversible end of all possible personal as well as historical futures. Secondly, aging can be a chance to regain the community sense and to revive moral beliefs, as it is obvious in the characters of the aged computer hackers. Thirdly, there is the nostalgic dimension of aging, visible in the leitmotivic picture of the married couple Takazawa, taken in the times before the wife's death, which can mediate the return to a space of hope and fulfillment, strongly contrasting to the late modern age dominated by hedonism and superficiality. However, Rojin Z is a synthesis. During the 1980s, three animation productions seemed to have prepared its emergence by highlighting specific tendencies. Firstly, Miyazaki Hayao's animation movie Nausicaa from the Valley of the Winds, or in Japanese Kaze no Tani no Nausicaa from 1984, which designs a vision of the apocalypse, implying the salvation of humanity exclusively by means of a direct, peaceful, mutually respectful cooperation with nature, gathering the forces of all survivors. Nausicaa's balanced, complex personality challenges the image of the broken, confused late modern human being conceptualized by social analysts. Her self-sacrifice stands for necessary, inevitable historical U-turn based on love and compassion. Secondly, the animation movie, The Imperial Spaceship Fleet, The Wings of Honeamise, or in Japanese, Oritsu Uchugun, Oneamise no Tsubasa from 1987, produced by Gainax Studio with the largest budget at the time, which speaks in nostalgic, bittersweet tones of hopes and dreams and of the price paid for their fulfillment in a world strangely reminiscent of the 1950s. Lada Chiro, the male main character, had lost any hope of a socially accredited family life, but nevertheless, he manages to travel in a capsule in the outer space, thus fulfilling the dream of his religiously overzealous friend Lequini to launch that capsule before any other would do it, though in the midst of international military conflicts. Lada's faith in his human fellows, despite their occasional evil behavior, inspires a more reflexive existential attitude to unmistakably include tolerance and forgiveness. 2 years after this nostalgic, still unusually positive animation movie, Miyazaki Hayao's Kiki's Delivery Service, or in Japanese Majo no Takubin from 1989, number one at the box office of the year with over 40 million US dollars sale numbers, reminds of the healthy world of the childhood within the never-ending festival of life. The general optimism is counterpointed by unsettling accents of the first initiation rites, the joy and curiosity of the growing up process are counterbalanced by the yearning for the bright universe of the family and of the homeland. Kiki would eventually find her place in the new life order after overcoming the inherent difficulties with that bright attitude to enjoy every day at its fullest in harmony with herself and with nature. Still, Akira's release and its radically divided destiny in Japan and overseas, a historical flop in Japan, a cult product in the West, would brutally disrupt the aesthetic and ideological presentation of these three dimensions of the human existence in Japanese animation works: apocalypse, nostalgia, and festival. Coupled with Emperor Hirohito's death and with the economic recession to put an end to the bubble economy era, Akira marked a reference point in the Japanese post-war cultural history. 3 years later, in 1991, Rojin Z follows up Japanese animation works of the 1980s and summarizes their accomplishments in regard to the above-mentioned three expression modes, apocalypse, festival, and nostalgia, while tackling the problematic of the population aging. Thus, aging becomes an initiation trip and a creative endeavor in a world dominated by the imperative of a cool existence. The director Otomo Katsuhiro constructs the plot of Rojin Z, actively underlying the power of ordinary facts as capable to trigger extraordinary feelings in conventional social actors as a legitimation for their own existence. As such, it is an artistic process which could easily lead to an effacement of the often arbitrary demarcation line between mass and elite, young and old, rich and poor. Seriously taking into account the challenges posed by the uncontrollable aging to the political, economic, and social life means accepting society as a dynamic, heterogeneous entity so that changes from within become possible both on collective and on individual level. Otomo Katsuhiro reflects upon ideology, in this case, the ideology of aging, as an alternative, cool existential attitude, incorporating apocalypse, festival, and nostalgia as chances to a worthwhile existence in the midst of crumbling historical structures. Thus, ideology becomes part of the subjects who are not only possessing it, but also internalizing it as a part of their own self, as Louis Althusser had famously put it decades ago. Rather than metamorphosing life into a constant adjourned fantasy, a consumption-stimulating desire, an eternal promise never to be attained, so that the escape from reality becomes possible only as and or in fantasy, Rojin Z calls for a pragmatic worldview to facilitate the awareness of actively living by own standards, while still accepting and respecting the others in their own singularity. Like several other post-industrialized, late capitalist nations, Japan too seems to have lost in the post-war era its inner balance, threefold. Firstly, the healthy balance between material and mental prosperity. Secondly, the positive balance between tradition and innovation. And thirdly, the progressive balance between individual and society. In such a train of thought, the most obvious side effect is the repeated obsessive representation of aging as a disparate issue, a black hole in everyone's biography, inevitably leading to loneliness and death. Aging human beings position themselves, therefore, outside the mainstream life, and their existence becomes a sort of a parallel discourse to the normal world. Even though it might stem from good intentions, this parallel discourse remains, however, extrinsic to the normality of common people and is, as such, unable to enhance and transcend the living subject within its own community. Thus, the very grammatical I of that subject alienates, becomes an outside I, and metamorphoses ineluctably the I into an object, whereby the words expressing it can never confer it the joy of life, of a living being with feelings, thoughts, and personality. It is a world of the strong, dominant other, declining any access to the small self into the within of the symbolical fulfillment. While reversing the perspective could bring a welcome change of the perception, the plurality of the possible others proves to be both fascinating and disturbing, and points out simultaneously to the plurality of the selves, and to the everlasting attempt to grasp it in its diversity, both fascinating and disturbing as well. The dying patient Takazawa Kiyuro is a prototype for the isolation and desperation of life, as a doll kept alive by means of technology but lacking human warmth and company. Mitsuhashi Haruko's character. Her efforts to rescue and care for the patient, in spite of all her problems, including coping with her own everyday challenges, stands for a dynamic, sincere I in the midst of an increasingly indifferent society. The representation of aging as a hopeless fall in Rojin Z is generally the practical reflection of the postmodern discussions on fragmented identities and the necessary rewriting of historical events. On the one hand, there is the disappearance of the social bond, experienced as familiar and necessary for a long while in the past. On the other hand, there is the increasingly accelerated transition from social communities constructed and imagined as naturally homogeneous to individual societies, as well constructed and imagined as naturally heterogeneous and free. Individual aging is in common perception a preparation for death. And death is the apocalypse of the individual, that point of no return no one could ever avoid. Nevertheless, death and its function as individual apocalypse does not appear in Rojin Z as the end of the individual life, but rather as a rite of passage, implying both those directly concerned, like Takazawa Kiyuro, and their immediate environment, as the total collapse of the world as we know it both refers to the individual and to social rebirth following apocalyptical cataclysms. However, comparable to Reason and Love, Apocalypse, the third great legitimating narrative of the modern age, seems to keep its ideological validity despite disenchanting statements within the happy and aesthetics. Rojin Z summarizes, thus, the characteristics of the fundamentally apocalyptic works by condensing them: narration tangibility, myth negotiation, prophecy credibility, crusade heroism, therapeutic effect, in a vision of the society as radically transformed by chaos and by the imminent denial of the status quo to evolve into total liberation, resulting into eternal peace and harmony. It is indeed a world in which more intensively than ever human beings have become accustomed to the idea of resurrection, while simultaneously still feeling fearful at the idea of death and apocalypse. There are not only few children and generally little hope, but the aging population in specific poor quarters of metropolis, like the Arakawa urban district in Rojin Z, one of the poorest areas of Tokyo, is ignored, driven into despair, or exploited as guinea pigs for highly dubious experiments. It is basically the artistic visualization of the intrinsically binary nature of apocalyptic teleology. Renewal and rebirth emerge from destruction and chaos, but only through the conscious, active intervention of a savior, existing outside of time and space, usually accompanied by a small group of chosen ones, taking over the responsibility for the fate of the world in times of major crisis. That is, in Rojin Z, the character of Mitsuhashi Haruko. On a more individual level, through the representation of aging as individual apocalypse, Rojin Z addresses the idea of popular culture as being a barometer for social mental conditions. If the liberation of the individual from historical obligations is unavoidably accompanied by his or her isolation, then the directly experienced feelings of loneliness within the social group is a basic condition for alienation and identity confusion, or even identity loss. Exactly like the isolated aging computer hackers or the four alienated students, Haruko and her friends, striving to rescue the patient captive to the technologically highly developed bed, there seems to be an emergence of increasingly marginalized groups unable to relate to other groups, and gradually unable to relate within the group either, always at the border to normality, never within prevalent standards, longing for the right to express themselves. This is where the power of an author of popular culture products like Otomo Katsuhiro intervenes and takes over the task to speak for the voiceless. Rojin Z is a document, in Foucault's parlance, to be understood rather as a symbol of the many silenced voices, and less as a culture artifact to reflect the efforts to reconstruct human endeavors and histories at a certain point in time and at a specific place. In fact, it is an attempt to revive entities, structures, individualities, and relations within the social fabric, as Foucault had put it. In Rojin Z, History is dissociated from the picture to which it had belonged self-sufficiently for a long while and whereby it had found its anthropological justification, as it is the picture of a 1,000-years-old collective memory relying on material conditions and longing to regain fresh inputs. Thus, from a desperate endeavor against individual apocalypse, aging becomes a possibility to acknowledge the self in its undeniable singularity throughout times and spaces. As a typical Japanese animation work, Rojin Z is an unclouded gaze into a world which, despite deniable economic success in accordance with Western standards, lives according to other cultural norms than those Jewish Christian traditions still dominating the Western world. Religious or not, most Westerners have a monotheist, minimal pair-like vision of the universe governed by one God, one truth, one correct answer to every question, univoc justice eventually triumphing, and virtue being rewarded, reason being more reliable than emotion, a sharp delineation between reality and fantasy, things which are unconsciously, unquestionably accepted as such. Though, when confronted with something that obviously does not take those things for granted, a slight trace of doubt, and possibly of self-doubt, arises. The brutal confrontation, as in Rojin Z, with other distinct visions of truth, reason, reality, impacts on the implicitness of the familiar, coherent universe. For instance, the technical inferiority of Rojin Z as animation work compared to similar Western or even Japanese productions is counterbalanced by its high-tech appearance, an astonishing fantasy world with diversified and multi-dimensional characters. For instance, naive, weak men and self-confident, attractive women as well as humanized robots, and an authentic tension between good and evil in interchangeable positions. Moreover, definitely more intensively than in comparable live-action movies, Rojin Z reminds of a world in which the copy is at least as valuable as its original, mainly because that very copy can enhance and eventually replace the original, while grasping the essence of the surrounding reality better than the reality itself in its universality penetrating beyond the palpable fact. Faithful to its predecessors, classical stage arts and visual traditions, Japanese animation works often deal with the essentialization of reality and humanity in their innermost sincere facets. Rojin Z highlights the interlocking of ordinary quotidian facts with fantastic universes, bluntly displaying the brutal, inescapable either-or of today's world at large. Its main characters, Mitsuhashi Haruko and her friends Oe Nobuko, Sato Tomoe and Maeda Mitsurun, the project manager Terada Itaku, as well as the bad programmer Hasegawa Yoshihiko, are ambiguous individuals striving to demarcate themselves in the course of action from historical instances perpetuated via taboos, prohibitions, and hierarchies, and supported by a strict educational system. This intricate game with traditional values inworms, however, the illusion and the promise of other spaces, allowing for individual freedom, a progressive way of life, and for social appreciation. Gradually, the characters as individuals become active presences within the collective discourse, a phenomenon to have been historically observed in the development of the de-sexed good citizens of the late Meiji era into the self-confident and charismatic Japanese individuals of late modernity. In its course, the process touched upon the new humans of the 1910s, the modern girl, or Moga, and modern boy, or Mobo, of the 1920s, and the energetic population of the post-war period. While modern Japanese individuals, enlightened by various romantic and or subculture emancipation movements, identify themselves with the characters configured upon real existing common citizens, and they absorb them as behavior and thinking models, they metamorphose into faithful, still deeply dialectically modifying copies of this permanently negotiated identity stylization. In this train of thought, Rojin Z, as a Japanese animation production, becomes a tool to proactively design the fresh Japanese consciousness, sacrosanct in its fascinating singularity and exemplary in its individualizing power. Like McDonald's or rock and roll, the modern high-quality Japanese animation as a genre is a child of the post-war era, recording the imagination but not necessarily the voice of the radically eccentric life in one of the most industrialized nations. In Rojin Z, the most extreme, most individualist, and distinctly most uncontrollable expression and visual styles flow, particularly visible in the characters of the aging computer hackers and of the young students, communicating such feelings and attitudes as euphoria, desire, disappointment, longing, fatigue, ambition, depression, isolation, weirdness, banality, satire. Sometimes in a more open, sometimes in a more concealed manner. It filters their emotions and introduces them into an historical context to convey them with a spark of life. Rojin Z's characters carry along the story their hopes and frustrations, plunge into adventures, exaggerate their physical features, overreact to stimuli, enjoy their tribulations. They faint, sweat, bleed, are visibly excited, dismayed, shocked, embarrassed, amused, as in an attempt to challenge the contemporary Japanese environment with its still superhuman self disciplining mechanisms and strictly controlled mimic reactions. In a geographic space in which media, society, and intellectuals focus on the integrity of national ideology, the success of corporate organization, the technological awareness, and the aesthetics of history, genuine individuals in the immediate reality seem to be completely overflooded, together with their creativity. In Rojin Z, this general political project is deliberately questioned, with the simultaneous disclosure of a separate channel to transmit new existential attitudes emerging from the courage to face subjective beginnings. The humanist value won in the process encompasses tremendous potential for change and progress in a positive, balanced manner. In late modernity, human togetherness takes on a different shape as, admittedly, the aging computer hackers in Rojin Z communicate with the highly developed bad on the basis of an indirect relationship, the internet, which has evolved in the last quarter of the 20th century from an obscure technology without practical application beyond the secluded world of the computer specialists, hackers, and countercultural groupings to the status of a factory of human existences, accompanying and influencing historical events. In a slightly sarcastic, still somehow ritualist tone, Rojin Z speaks of the advantages of the old human togetherness, where direct face to face communication as the essence of human existence has not yet been replaced by the internet as the new communication environment and the new social form, the so called network society developing around the planet. Rojin Z's consistent message refers to the oldest fear of mankind, fear of its technological own manufactured monsters, and undermines the ambivalence towards the internet as a life conditioning element. Isolating oneself outside the network society is not an alternative, as one is at any rate being integrated within the network system. In fact, from the other end of the world, the bottom line in Rojin Z is that direct communication is a basic human need, no matter how solitaire someone might enjoy being. From the sincere open communication emerges historical awareness, gradually dispersing the fear to face the other in its radical alterity, and to accept it as such. Moral precepts are purely social cultural concepts and no transcendental visions of the universe. Thus, even if loyalty and courage define a character as a hero, they will not be able to save him or her in the immediate confrontation with adverse forces. The disenchanting message in Rojin Z is that though one might attempt to change the world, to save it, or simply to make it better or more beautiful, at the end of the day, the world does not care about the individual among the others. It is the individual's ability to deal with his or her fellow human beings within a given historical social structure that makes him or her special and unique. In this regard, Rojin Z delivers a substantially more honest picture of Japan than the affected Zen philosophy or the complicated No symbolism. It is exactly the point where the contrast between popular culture, embedded in everyday life with its faith and ideas, and the extremely stylized high culture rooted in an imagined past lies. Ultimately, it is the pragmatic approach opposing fantasies of hot girls, resplendent giant robots, and elegant samurai swords to sophisticated treatises on the evanescence of all worldly things. The common belief according to which Japanese animation is practically Japan talking to itself while consolidating its own myths and behavioral patterns, both implies and sustains the function of the domestic popular culture to display inner cultural tensions. For the disenchanted Shinjin Rui generation in Japan and X generation in the West, as well as for their successors, Japanese animation appears as an escape possibility at its best form. The illusion of infinite economic growth, of political liberation, of social commitments, and of cultural renewal is gone, in the same way as the unshakable faith in the importance, necessity, and rewards of hard work. As such, Japanese animation is created in and for a society in which personal behavior is strictly delimited both by physical agglomeration and by exact emotional conventions. Therefore, it has to offer a broad variation of fantasy worlds in which the spectators can realize their dreams and nightmares, which would otherwise stay repressed and never experience their fulfillment. Etymologically, originating from nostos, which is Greek for to return home, and algos, which is Greek for painful circumstance, nostalgia refers in the age of the universal disenchantment and liquefied identities to the painful longing for an original home, whereby this home is frequently conceptualized as basically an invention of the self. In Rojin Z, different stages of nostalgic aging are brought to the foreground by the old picture of the young couple Takazawa. Starting with a plain nostalgia for a time in which things were better, healthier, happier, the next level is the reflexive nostalgia in its painful sentimentalization of past facts, leading to the ultimate dimension of the intellectual nostalgia as the analytical revival of the past. The ongoing dialectic quest for continuity in the middle of discontinuous realities reconstructs the I as a pragmatic entity searching for solutions and ideals to overcome the typical feeling of the aging individual. There is simply no place left to go. The old picture of the young couple Takazawa is a refreshing moment in time, including the famous Buddha statue in Kamakura, in itself a symbol of durability and stability, ignoring that false sense of nostalgia as emotional solution. Through the direct reference to the Buddha statue in Kamakura, Rojin Z designs an alternative furusato or homeland, challenging the usual nostalgic framework. While the nostalgia orgy of the 1970s meant in the West the return to the safe space of the early modernity, in Japan, nostalgia meant the return to pre-modern times. As, historically speaking, a sporty loser, Japan grasped early enough the advantage to accept inevitable facts, treat them accordingly, and learn the best lessons out of them. Thus, the agriculture communities in which full-time farmers worked in pastoral peace functioned for a long while as necessary ideological reserves for the metropolitan, modern, and contemporary Japan. The celebration of the imaginary furusato, or homeland, as contrary to the concrete noson, or farmer village, appeared as a direct consequence of the 1966, the zero year of the my car era in the Japanese media. Nowadays conceptualized as homeland or home in the sense of a familiar place where one was born and or grew up, the term furusato is currently one of the most popular notions and symbols employed by Japanese politicians, town planners, and mass media advisors. The ubiquity of the furusato itself derives from the various contexts, highlighting belonging and security, in opposition with the alienating realities of Japan's urban areas. In Rojin Z, furusato as furusato zukuri or homeland creation, homeland construction, provides a basis for the political project of the systematization of common memories and social reproduction actions. Furusato is infused with the yearning for the past and the discontent with the present to legitimate unfulfilling future. The Buddha statue in Kamakura is a palpable furusato zukuri or creation, construction of homeland, integrates quotidian activities into the permanent pursuit of the human being for a healthy work-life balance and authentic happiness. Though primarily one more Japanese cultural commodity such as technology or cars, Japanese animation and thus Rojin Z mediates beyond techno-orientalist cliches and a worldview in which classical rapports between production and consumption, self and other, free speech and political correctness, ontology and axiology are frontally challenged, subtly undermined and potentially brutally disrupted. While being a provocation to the Western hegemony without basically questioning it, because it exists as such only in the Western hierarchy, Japanese animation techno-orientalizes Japan within a self-referred legitimization process. Thus, aging appears in Rojin Z as the result of nostalgic reviews and disappointed expectations. The hybrid realities of today's Japan, with its multiple transnational exchanges in commerce, culture, science, technology, are incorporated within the prevalent political discourses on national purity and homogeneity, nostalgically drawing their arguments from pre-modern remembrances, while the simple fact that this disturbing cultural reconfiguration is an ideological attempt to deny and suppress national fears through rationalizing technologies, individualizing practices, and totalizing machineries is furtively ignored. Aging is a vital dialectic in Rojin Z, reminding that reproductive nostalgia and neo-nostalgia cannot completely eliminate passive longings of many Japanese individuals for the revival of a past long gone. Obsessed to catch up with Western standards of power and development, the Meiji technocrats imported in the record time frame not only technologies and institutions of Western capitalism, but also centuries of aesthetic theories, literary forms, and social representation modes. Not only railways, but also Descartes. Not only financial capital, but also Renaissance perspective. Not only Prussian literalism, but also Ibsen dramatism. It was an unbalanced relationship penetrated by strong undercurrents of seduction, resistance, and assimilation, though the fundamental point of the early Meiji era had consisted in the constitution of a modern nation-state capable to successfully compete with comparable political structures in the West. Idealist as it might have felt, it was indeed an all-encompassing process, leading only decades later to the activation of the effective semiotic constellation of the pre-Meiji Japan. In the third decade of the new millennium, Japan sometimes seems, seen from the outside, like a disappearing country, the result of a way too fast modernized world having jumped from pre-modernity by a much too brief modernization process directly into postmodernity. While such animation movies like Nausicaa from the Valley of the Winds, the Imperial Spaceship Fleet, The Wings of Honeamise, Akira, and Kiki's Delivery Service could stay as the auftakt to the Great Disenchantment at the dawn of the 1990s, following Emperor Hirohito's death on January 7, 1989, and the enormous economic recession in the year 1990, major events such as the case of the girl serial murderer Miyazaki Tsutomu from late 1980s, the Great Kansai earthquake from January 1995, and the sarin gas attack of the Om Shinrikyo cult in March 1995 in Tokyo subway profoundly shook the Japanese society. Accordingly, many Japanese animation works released since the beginning of the 1990s typically carry the atmosphere of constant fearfulness, faithfully reflecting the attitude of permanent uncertainty in the Japanese society after the brutal awakening from the widely shared faith of Japan being a clean, non-violent world based on a perfectly functioning social system. In its ambiguous representation of aging, Rojin Z takes over the task to produce and send warning signals on sensitive, though ignored, topics by means of popular culture elements. If the power of the Japanese animation consists in its abstract form and its practical contents, Rojin Z belongs to the category of disenchanting works suggesting direct solutions without unnecessary lecturing. This occurs while reshaping aging, not as a lost area of history and society, but as a threefold phenomenon, including visions and solutions. On a first level, Rojin Z overcomes the optimism of Nausicaa from the Valley of the Winds as apocalyptical work and positions itself between Akira and Neo Genesis Evangelion. Apocalypse, seen as the end of the world as we know it, leads to an identity constitution process as a lonely, alienating endeavor in a disappearing universe. The ultimate fight in Akira between the main character Tetsuo against his best friend Kaneda Shotaro in and over the Olympic Stadium in Yoyogi contains a clear reference to the pre-Shinji Rui generation, which had developed the Olympic Stadium as a proud symbol of New Japan, and points out at the emergence of a new world from Tetsuo's orgy of destruction. A world which cannot contain any reassuring policies within a fragile future. Rojin Z and its embittered representation of aging is continued in Neo Genesis Evangelion, proving that the liberation of the individual from historical compulsions only means his direct isolation. Like the four main characters of the Evangelion series, the three alienated teenagers and their 29-year-old supervisor, the largest part of the mankind seems to be in an unequal relationship of power to a superior force, known as an increasingly abstract elite. Later Japanese animation productions would address even more intensively this large issue of myth and illusion destruction, preserving in their troubling effect the refusal to unequivocally seize the human being as a binary structure consisting of a good and an evil side, or a rational and an emotional half. In particular, Japanese animation series such as Serial Experiment Lane, with the same title in Japanese, released in 1998 under the direction of Nakamura Ryutaro, or Death Note, in Japanese Death Note, released in 2006 and 2007 under the direction of Araki Tetsuro, celebrate the evil in humans. Their tone swears on the failure of the culture, on the incompatibility of human impulses to cultural requirements, reminding of a dark worldview reminiscent of Arthur Schopenhauer. On a second level, Rojin Z takes over as a celebration work the positive tones from the wings of Honeamise and announces later masterpieces such as Princess Mononoke, in Japanese Mononoke Hime from 1997, under the direction of Miyazaki Hayao, which would describe the necessity of persistent dreams and of the belief in gods in a crumbling world. In its visual representation of epic fights between gods and humans beyond the surface of an ideological glorification of pure nature in opposition to the insanity of humans, there is the dramatic celebration of life and love as the best things one possesses and could ever possess. The climax of this celebrating development in Japanese animation works is Hoho Kekyo, My Neighbors the Yamada, or in Japanese Hoho Kekyo, Tonari no Yamada-kun from 1999, under the direction of Takahata Isao, which transmits in short sketches the subtle message that life can be eventless and a man might be mocked by his own children, neglected by his own wife, overseen at work by his peers, but he still has his dreams of an heroic existence where he might not be able to save the whole world, but at least his own family from quotidian senselessness. Not only young Japanese in post-recession Japan can extract fresh life projects and models to follow from such works, but also Western youngsters in a super-saturated society. Despite its economic failure at the box office, the bright, cheerful family comedy named Hoho Kekyo, My Neighbors the Yamada tells of family values and intergenerational interdependence, of social conformism and personal fulfillment, of everyday love in the life of average actors, and of individual solutions to social compulsions. On a third level, Rojin Z is a source of inspiration as a nostalgic work in the trajectory of bright humanism initiated by Kiki's Delivery Service, and prepares the way ahead for such animation movies like Ghost in the Shell, or in Japanese Kokaku Kidoutai, and translate literally the Mobile Employment Troop Against Chaos Attacks, which was released in 1996 under the direction of Oshima Moro. Ghost in the Shell tells of human longings in a world populated by cyborgs and robots. Another such animation series is Cowboy Bebop, in Japanese Cowboy Bebop, released in 1998 under the direction of Watanabe Shinichiro. The adventures and concerns of the main characters in Cowboy Bebop are those of quotidian social actors, even if they live in an era in which the entire universe has been transformed into a human habitat. They do not admit it, but they long for love and security, as well as for clear guidelines against the background of a frequently dark or unresolved past. It is the quest for one's profound self, as driven by individual belonging, to a generation who often feels left alone at crossroads without any clear direction signs. The old models vanished in intellectual treatises on humanity, reason, and progress, while those supposed to use them as existential and spiritual models drowned into confusion and isolation. The climax of this development is the animation movie 5 cm per second, in Japanese Byosoku go Centimetro, released in 2008 under the direction of Shinkai Makoto, which evokes the evanescence of the human existence and describes in heartbreaking tones the loss, regain, and renewed loss of love in an everyday life where too many things happen at once. Immersed in a stress ratio between the ephemeral plasticity of quotidian coolness and the confident durability of the Japanese classical culture, Japanese animation absorbed and adapted alien influences around the firm core. Cultural power as a self-reflexive process is, in this perspective, a consequence of economic growth, becoming, in turn, the catalyst of economic growth in times of crisis. While the assumption that exactly Japan's insularity has kept it from exploiting the latent power of its cultural assets at the time, or at least at a comparable extent as other nations did with their reserves of soft power, might be somehow correct, current substantial and repetitive globalization, ruptures, economic recessions, and political confusions undermine and disconcert Japan in its fundamental values and traditional ideals, affecting broad fields of life from management culture to family lifestyle, thus forcing it to rethink its strategies in dealing with cultural issues as means of historical resurrection. Japan's long experience of remarkable comebacks naturally suggests rebirth out of today's decline, not at least due to its immense reserves of potential, gentle reinvigoration mechanisms. Rojin Z's representation of aging basically highlights the, maybe sometimes forgotten, fact that old persons are similar to young people in their pursuit for happiness, singular individualities striving to overcome the difficulties of life by assuming cool aplomb and fresh joy. Through the warm humanism of this positive message, Rojin Z aligns itself in the tradition of optimist artworks, describing the human being as a fascinating, however incomplete entity to be admired and celebrated instead of being indoctrinated and condemned. So that would be from me for today. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I'm looking forward to welcoming you very soon again. Love and peace to you all.